Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about the books that I read in the first half of August. Definitely been an interesting month for reading, with a couple of books being a little bit outside of my normal reading, by which I mean that two of the books that I read were actually more on the children's middle grade side, which is not really typical for me. But then a couple are history based, so you know, that's true to form, isn't it? But I'm going to start off with the book that I'm not going to talk about too much right now, because this was the book club pick for the I Should Have Read That book club, which I'm hosting alongside Shannon at 155 Books in Carys from Carys's Corner, and you'll be able to check out the live stream for that sometime at the end of this month. But that book was Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, which I know is a book that has been very popular in the last couple of years, and tells the story of Queenie Jenkins, who is a young black woman living in London. We're following her particularly at a bit of a crisis point in her life. She's just broken up with her boyfriend Tom and kind of reeling from it, and as a result of the heartbreak and depression that she feels, she starts to go down a bit of a bad path and tries to cope with her heartbreak by sleeping with lots of different men, most of whom do not treat her very well at all. Her friends are all concerned for her. Her boss is noting frequently how she's not doing her job, how she's easily distracted, and all the while you're just really desperately hoping that Queenie can pull herself out of this hole. We're getting a chance to look at the day-to-day microaggressions that Queenie faces. For me personally, this was a reread, and I still kind of feel the same way that I did the first time round, which is that this is not a personal favourite, but I feel like the topics of discussion are going to be really interesting. So I'm very keen to have that chat at the end of the month and see what conversations we can draw out from this. Next up we have The Scandalous Lady W by Hallie Rubenhold, 18th century tale of sex, scandal and divorce. You might recognise the name Hallie Rubenhold as she was the author of The Five, which was the very popular history non-fiction chronicling the lives of the victims of Jack the Ripper, as well as one that I recently read, which was The Covent Garden Ladies, which that in turn inspired the show Harlots. And in fact you might actually recognise this name, The Scandalous Lady W, as this was recently adapted into a BBC film starring Natalie Dormer. This tells the scandalous story of the divorce proceedings between Richard Worsley and his wife Seymour on the grounds of adultery. Richard trying to extricate himself from this marriage but without having to pay anything to Seymour, because he claimed that she had been unfaithful, that she'd really made a mockery of their marriage, that she'd been sleeping around here, there and everywhere, and that, you know, as a poor husband he was completely blameless. However, the court and 18th century society were shocked when Seymour Worsley and her lover George Bissett were able to shoot right back at him and say, yeah, Lady Worsley did sleep around, she did have a lot of lovers, but you know what, Lord Worsley is not as blameless as you think, and in fact he actually commissioned some of these men to sleep with her. He knew all along about these affairs, he encouraged them, he did nothing about it, therefore he is not blameless. This recounts their incredibly up and down marriage, the divorce proceedings, but also the largest chunk of the book is detailing their lives after this scandal broke out, and particularly chronicling how both of these people did not get out of this marriage scot-free. They were very much seen as social pariahs, not really accepted anymore in fashionable society, and I just thought it was a really fascinating glimpse as to the social mores and how the 18th century beau monde dealt with scandalous behaviour. I would say that this is actually my favourite thing that I've read by Hallie Rubenhold. I know a lot of people really love The Five, but I think this was the most interesting, and I think maybe it's because we're just focusing really on these two characters. I think what was also really interesting with this one was also chronicling this marriage, this scandal, but also how effects of the wider world were really playing a part, particularly the American Declaration of Independence and the subsequent war with America, and how those events fed into people's attitudes to this divorce proceeding. And what I think is really great about this is that neither of these characters are portrayed as being wholly blameless or wholly villainous, which I think after reading this is now a criticism that I could give of the film that came out a few years ago, because in the film it's definitely this idea that Seymour was the one who's wronged, and the film kind of depicts the divorce proceedings and the trial as this like girl power moment. She's really sticking it to her husband who's horrible, but actually Seymour doesn't come across as a particularly sympathetic character in this. They're both kind of as bad as each other. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Highly recommend this, especially if you are interested in the 18th century and this fashionable society and what they would and would not permit from its members. Next up we have a historical fiction pick. We have Cecily by Annie Garthwaite, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm kind of struggling about how I can talk about this and what the plot of this book is, and I struggle with that because on the one hand it's history. This is fictional, but it is based on the life of Cecily Neville, who was a historic person who existed. And what I find hard with this is that the thing that's going to make you interested to read this is technically going to be the spoilers around it. I feel like the least spoiler explanation of this book that I could give you is that this chronicles the life of a wife of a very prominent figure in the Wars of the Roses, and is kind of charting her position in the Wars of the Roses and her involvement, giving commentary on women's position in the 15th century and the kind of political power that wives and mothers could have. And that's all I could really give you, but I feel like that's not enough. So if you don't want any spoilers beyond that, then skip ahead now. But to everybody who is staying, this is about the life of Cecily Neville, who was wife to Richard created Duke of York and who went on to become the mother of Edward IV and Richard III. And suddenly I can already feel like the interest is piqued, but that is technically a spoiler. The fact that her husband is Richard of York, who we know gave battle in vain, is a spoiler. The fact that her sons go on to be Edward IV and Richard III, that is a spoiler. They become king. But for me, having that knowledge was what made me want to read this. But anyway, I digress. I feel like the main comparison that is going to be thrown around a lot with this book, and I do kind of agree with, is that this is very, very reminiscent of Wolf Hall. In fact, I think there is actually a quote on the back which says, "Cecily stalks the corridors of power like a female Thomas Cromwell," and that comes from Imogen Hermes Gower, who wrote The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock. And I do think the comparisons between Wolf Hall and Thomas Cromwell and then Cecily Neville are just really, really apparent, especially in terms of the political discussions that are going on in this book, the amount of attention to detail, the amount of research that has gone into this book, but with one major startling difference, which is of course the fact that Cecily Neville is a woman living in this time period and also having to conform to the expected gender norms of this society, that being a wife and a mother. And we're seeing both how this doesn't constrict like her ability, her mental ability to participate, but also physically how it does constrict her, because no sooner is Cecily participating in the politics than she has to be confined away because she's pregnant, and she is seen first and foremost as important because she has to sire heirs to her husband. And that is a major difference that you do not come across with Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall. And I feel like very easily Annie Garthwaite could have written this where she kind of skirts over the childbirth element. The fact that Cecily has multiple children could have just been like, oh yeah, and then I had a child. But no, it's very, very visceral. The effect that it has on her mentally and physically is not skipped over. I think the other standout thing about this book is really the relationship between Cecily and her husband Richard. I think so often in historical fiction you are treated to a portrayal of marriage that is very negative. Often, you know, a gruff, older, sometimes even abusive man to a young, impressionable woman, but really this is a partnership of equals. You can see that there is so much love between these two and they're a real partnership. And often how she is spurring on Richard to do more than he wants to do politically. I think a good comparison for her would be somebody like Olenna Tyrell in Game of Thrones. The one thing that I would say is a bit of a negative about this is that obviously it's, you know, it's not actually a massive historical fiction. There's around about 400 pages, 366 pages in this book, but we're covering quite a lot of history. This chronicles around about 30 years or so. Though to be fair to this book, I thought it was actually going to cover a lot more. This chronicles from 1431 up until I'm going to put the date in because I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's when Edward becomes Edward IV, when he defeats Henry VI's forces at the Battle of Towton. And considering that Cecily Neville actually lives from 1415 all the way up to 1495, so she actually sees all of her sons die. She is there for Henry VII defeating her son at the Battle of Bosworth, and she sees the first decade of Tudor reign. I feel like very easily you could have taken this book all the way to then. And I don't know if that's because Annie Garthwaite is considering writing a sequel to this. I'd be very interested to check that out. But I think not really a negative. I was just kind of shocked that it didn't continue that far. What I would also say for this is that I don't think this is a book that you can go into without knowing anything about the Wars of the Roses. This definitely takes for granted that you will know the names of the prominent people, that you will understand the significance of certain dates and places, or at the very least, like I hear a lot of people have to do for Wolf Hall, I would definitely suggest having a Wikipedia page or two up and having a quick glance at that as you come up to different names and people that you don't know. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this. And then finally, the two middle grade books that I read this month. We have the third book in the series of unfortunate events. I wasn't really planning on reading this month, but I happened to find it in the charity shop and I thought, yes, I will continue. This is The Wide Window, where the Baudelaire children have been sent to their grammar-obsessed, absolutely terrified of everything Aunt Josephine. And I think part of the reason I was able to speed through this is that, once again, I have seen the original movie from 2005, which kind of adapts the first three books. So once I pick up the fourth book, I will be leaving the territory of things that I know from this series. And yeah, my thoughts are pretty much the same as I had for the other two. As an adult, I find these to be pretty quick reads. I think I got through this in like an hour, but I think I felt the same kind of frustration that I would have felt as a child at the complete ineptness of the adults in this situation, how they never listen to the Baudelaire children, who are always right. There are aspects to this where I do get a little bit frustrated. For example, Lemony Snicket's habit of repeating things over and over for reinforcement, or explaining words, defining words for us, which I get that if I was a child I would find really helpful, but as an adult I'm just kind of like, but why? It just feels like bulking out the page, but I get why it is there. I also kind of felt like the resolution to this, how they discovered Count Olaf, was not as interesting as the previous two books. And also I wasn't as invested in Aunt Josephine as I was in Uncle Monty. Poor Uncle Monty. So at the moment I would say that my ranking of the three books I've read so far would be probably 2, 1 and then 3. But I'm still very much intrigued to pick up the fourth book and to just keep going on with this series and just let's see, now that I'm out of film territory, what do I think of this series? And then another popular middle grade series that I know a lot of people read when they were children but I did not is Percy Jackson. So I read Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief this month. This, for those of you who also never read these as a child, this tells the story of Percy Jackson, who is living in modern day, though I will say there are a few references in this that definitely date it to the early 2000s, who believes that he lives in a normal world. But it very, very quickly becomes apparent that in this modern world, the gods of Olympus do very much exist, and they reside in North America. And Percy Jackson is not just normal Percy Jackson at all, he is in fact a half-blood, his mother being a mortal woman, but his father, it turns out, is Poseidon. And after some near-fatal incidents, Percy ends up having to be recruited into Camp Half-Blood to learn about his background and to train up as a demigod and find out where he fits in this world. And it's not long until he ends up being commissioned to go on a quest that only he and a couple of other friends can fulfill, that being to locate the Master Bolt that was stolen from Zeus and return it to him. Once again, I'm not going to talk about this too much because I do think I've got a video about this that's going to go up, which is not really a review as such as it is all of my jumbled thoughts that I had during the process of reading this. But I will say I kind of found this book to be a little bit of a mixed bag for me. I was trying really, really hard not to compare this book to another fantasy series that I read as a child, but there were a lot of comparisons that I could have made. I think what's very startling about this is that it is very modern, very colloquial, not just from the mortals who are living in modern day, but also the gods themselves. The gods have very much adapted to the modern way of talking, which can feel a little bit jarring at times. And it's funny because in books like The Silence of the Girls, which is Greek myth retelling, I wasn't really bothered by it, but in this I was just kind of like, okay. I'm not sure how used I am to hearing Ares call someone dude. And that can also mean that it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of humour. There are definitely moments in this where I laughed, and I found especially Hades to be quite funny, just as this very overworked god of the dead. I find the premise of this very interesting, and I do have the other books in this series, so I'm definitely going to pick them up, but I feel like it's not quite wormed its way into my heart just yet. I think part of the reason for that is that I don't feel like the characters are particularly strong, and that's because a lot of the focus of this is on the plot and on the pace. Like, this is very, very fast paced, and I'm typically quite a slow paced reader. I like for there to be a lot more focus on character than this book currently has, but that could be filled out in the next few books. This is just very much like this happened, this happened, this happened, and there are no like breathing room moments. There are no moments where people are just kind of like sat around not doing much and just chatting, which I kind of missed. But then again, if I was a kid reading this, I'd be like, so many things are happening, and I'd be thoroughly entertained. So it's definitely not a negative judgment on this book at all, it's just my personal taste. But like I say, I'm definitely intrigued by this series. I'm definitely going to pick up the next book and we will see where it takes me. So there we go, those are all of the books that I have read in the first half of August. Do let me know if you've read any of these books, and let me know about any books that you yourself have read in August. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.